So, welcome everybody. I'm happy to see so many people here. There seems to be some kind of high expectations, but they are very justified because we have Bob Goodin. I was going to say our own Bob Goodin because a long-time friend and visitor to the Institute and involved in many, many projects here at the Institute. Very well known, but let me take the opportunity to say something. So, Bob is a professor of philosophy and social and political theory at ANU, Australian National University. He received his PhD in 1975 with the also well-known Brian Barry as supervisor. Has written so many books and articles, I don't know what to pick out, but you have written. What I'm most interested in, of course, is what you've written about the boundary problem in democratic theory, which we have, of course, written together.
We have written.
We also have written, but you also wrote a paper before that. Generally spanning very nicely political theory to involving more empirical stuff. And this year he was awarded the Johan Schutte Prize in political science. And now I'm going to quote from the motivation. Acuity and success endeavored to blend political philosophy with empirical political science to increase the understanding of how decent and dignified society can be shaped. That's not bad. The floor is yours.
Well, we'll try. So let me start with an apology. I wanted to present this project in its early stage 2 years ago, but stuff got in the way. Now I have the advantage instead of advertising my forthcoming book, which is already in press. I like the cover, but I'm afraid it means that I can't benefit, at least for this book, from your comments today, and it's not something I ordinarily do. So structural injustice. Injustices usually we think of as things that are pretty blatant. Somebody steals somebody's wallet or car or land or something. It's clear who did it to whom and all that sort of thing. But even in those blatant cases of injustice, there are structures in the background. There's structures of property law, there's structures of politics and economics, and sometimes those background structures aren't in the background, they're right in the foreground, right in your face, so much so that they can sometimes obscure the fact that there's any agency working behind them at all to do the injustice. And so sometimes, if you just focus on the structures that most immediately cause things to happen in the world, you say, well, it looks pretty innocuous. The structures make sense. They're serving some purpose. There's no evil bastard that obviously did anything nasty. And that, in a way, is the problem of structural injustice. It hides the fact of injustice. Let me just give you a couple of examples of that just to sort of get us on the same page before I go into analysis of how it happens. The first is Hurricane Katrina in 2005. You might remember it, major hurricane, flooded lots of New Orleans, mostly areas where poor black people lived. Now, hurricanes, nobody obviously caused them. We can ask questions about climate change. The hurricane doesn't discriminate. The poor black people were living down in the floodplain, not because the government zoned this as an area that poor blacks have to live. It just so happens that poor blacks can only afford cheap houses. Houses in the floodplain are cheap because they're likely to get flooded. And when they were flooded, most of them didn't have insurance. But again, it wasn't because some racist insurance underwriter refused to write them insurance policies. It's just because if you have a house in the floodplain, the probability of getting flooded is high. Actuarially fair insurance against getting flooded is correspondingly high. Poor black people can't afford high insurance premiums. So these guys got flooded out on the face of it through causes that had nothing to do with any nefarious human agency. Now, you might push the question about, well, okay, so why are they poor and why do they have to live down? But on the face of it, it looked like all these structural causes of their getting flooded out and not being insured against flooding look like, perfectly harmless, innocuous, nobody to blame sort of causes. Well, you might say, look, the familiar sob stories, so familiar, they sort of wash over you. Let me give you another example of structural power as well. This concerns the 2008 global financial crisis. Background, remember what caused the financial crisis. It was dodgy lending in the subprime housing markets in the US. People defaulted on their house loans. Banks were under stress. They stopped lending to each other. One thing leads to another. Lehman Brothers collapsed in the biggest bankruptcy in US history. The problem was securely in the US economy. So you'd like to imagine that naturally people would want to get out of the US economy and want to get their money out of US dollars in response to this problem in the US economy. But look what happened. So what we have here is the pound sterling US dollar exchange rate. The blue arrow corresponds to the onset of the global financial crisis. Instead of money going out of the US dollar, money went out of pound sterling. Pound sterling dropped precipitously. American dollar rose precipitously, just the opposite of what you'd expect. And it's not just sterling. There is the euro corresponding chart. Money ran out of the euro into the US dollar, despite the fact the problem was in the US economy. So what's going on? Well, the reason is structural, as you might imagine. And the structure in question is the notion of a global reserve currency of choice. The US dollar is the global reserve currency of choice. When there is trouble in the global economy, everybody runs to the global reserve currency of choice, in this case the US dollar. Why do they do that? Well, because everybody else does that. It's a confidence trick. Nobody is thinking hard about, well, actually, no, this is where the problem lies. I want to be in that if you want to be in that. And it's a sort of big confidence circle. So there is an example of structural power. So with those two in the background, let me get to the business of the presentation today. By way of preface, let me say three things about the focus of the book and presentation. First, I'm going to focus on the mechanisms of social injustice. I mean, what makes it happen? What drives it? Usually discussions of structural injustice talk more about the sites of structural injustice. So, the global reserve currency of choice, that's one site of structural injustice, or geopolitical organizations, the P5 and with vetoes in the UN Security Councils, another site of structural injustice, or housing markets or educational systems. Why is Harvard such a ticket to success in life? It's not what it teaches you at Harvard, I assure you. But all that's about where structural injustice happens. I'm interested in how it happens. Okay, so that's the first point about the focus. The second is that I'm going to be more concerned with stopping structural injustice going forward rather than remedying the effects of what's happened in the past. I'm not saying you shouldn't remedy the effects of what happened in the past. It's just sometimes pretty hard. It's hard sometimes because you have amorphous groups of people on both sides of the equation. It was an unorganized amorphous group who suffered the wrong, an amorphous unorganized group who did the wrong. How do you get your hands on them? How do you identify them? Sometimes the problem is it was injustice long in the past. Too many forks in the road between then and now. Have no idea of knowing what we would have been looking at now as the outcome, given all those forks, all those counterfactuals. Just too hard to reckon. And sometimes, as I said with Hurricane Katrina, just doesn't look like there's anybody obviously to blame. So this idea of blaming people and rectifying people by, compensating victims by putting the hard word on perpetrators, if you can do it, fine, but sometimes it's actually pretty hard. So I'm going to be interested in stopping structural injustice in its tracks now, preventing more of it from being inflicted on people going forward. And finally, though I'll use the phrase structural injustice a lot, I'm actually not going to be talking so much about injustice in the first instance. And that's strategic. What is and isn't an injustice? Interesting question. You can talk about it forever. We philosophers do. It's so absorbing a question that you never actually get on to the next question, right? So reading bedtime stories to your kids, is that an injustice? Well, it advantages your kids. They don't deserve to be advantaged in that way particularly. Maybe it's an injustice, maybe it's not. No, let's just put a lid on those discussions. What I'm going to be focusing on instead is mechanisms that perpetuate advantage and disadvantage, some of which are unjust, some of which may not be unjust. My thought here is just that, well, look, the same mechanism, the mechanisms that perpetuate advantage and disadvantage are the same whether the advantage and disadvantage in question is just or not. So we can bracket the question of injustice and just focus on the mechanisms that do this, that perpetuate advantage and disadvantage. And as I say, my interest in this book and talk really is mostly on the mechanisms, understanding how they work and trying to stop them from working insofar as they perpetuate injustice. So here is the sort of structure of the talk, and I promise to do it more quickly than that makes it seem. I'm going to be talking about these 6 surface mechanisms of structural injustice. I'll say more about each of them as I go along. You can probably work out what most of them involve anyway. And I'm going to be arguing that underlying each of these surface mechanisms are 2 deeper mechanisms of structural injustice. The first has to do with internal constraints on people's decision making. Time and attention are in short supply. We find advantageous to use various mechanisms, various short circuits for economizing on the time and attention we have to devote to any problem that faces us. And that feeds into a lot of these surface mechanisms that perpetuate structural injustice. Second underlying driver, these external opportunities that magnify the advantage of those who are already advantaged. Rich get richer, the Matthew effect, named after the gospel according to Matthew. One reason is increasing returns to scale. You'll probably say, oh yeah, that's the standard economic story about where monopolies come from, but it also feeds into a lot of these other surface mechanisms of structural injustice. The second, maybe less familiar thought, is that there are some resources that actually increase with use, right? Usually you have a resource like money. You spend some of it, you've got less after you've spent it. But there's some resources, some advantages that actually work the opposite way around. The more you use it, the more of it you have to use next time. And obviously anybody who's got that sort of resource, that sort of advantage, has, it's a golden egg layer, right? It's a source of further advantage down the track as you use it. So let's start working through the surface mechanisms one by one. I'll show first how they perpetuate advantage and disadvantage. I'll show secondly how those underlying mechanisms feed into those. And then at the end of the talk, I'll ask the question of, okay, so given what we now know about these mechanisms, what can we do to stop them from working when they work badly or unjustly. First, positional advantage. The position in question could be a position in a status hierarchy or a power hierarchy, in an organizational structure, or in a competitive situation. It's just in the nature of positional competition that the person in the best position wins. I mean, think of a bidding war, right? Whoever's got the most money they're willing to spend is going to win the bidding. So those who have get, the rich get richer, or anyway, the rich win. And what they sometimes win are resources that prove useful in the next round of the competition, of the positional competition. So you don't just win consumable resources. You earn, when you win, resources that set you up better for the next positional game and better able to win the next one as well. In terms of what makes the things work, I think there are these internal sources, informational sources. Knowing your opponent's place in any of these positional hierarchies gives you a better sense of whether you or he is going to win if you get into a pissing contest, right? And if it's clear that the other guy is going to win, and it's going to cost you resources to get into the pissing contest and lose it, then don't get into the fight, right? I mean, it's just the law of anticipated reactions, I mean, so the guy actually wins the pissing contest without pissing, right? He doesn't have to devote any resources to it. And that's an advantage, but what's driving the advantage is the rank in the positional ordering gives everybody information about who's likely to win and who's likely not to win in these games. There are also external sources, I think, to these positional advantages and the structural power they confer. And that has to do with the fact that positional advantage increases with use. So the more of these competitive struggles you get into, or you win by default when other people defer to you, the greater your reputational for positional advantage, the more this syndrome is going to repeat itself in the future. Or authority structures, status structures. The more you invoke your authority, the more authority you have to invoke. If you have notional authority you never invoke, then it withers away. So positional advantage is something that increases with use, and the advantaged get more advantaged the more they use it. The rich get richer again. The second surface mechanism I want to talk about is network advantage. It's an advantage to be networked with other people just because that enables you to interact with them, communicate, trade, whatever. Furthermore, the more centrally located you are in the network, the more advantaged you are, the cheaper it is for you to interact because you don't have to go through so many intermediaries. In the first instance, I think the source of these network advantages are internal, in ways I've just described. But there are interesting external sources to do with what economists call network externalities. And the idea here is simply that how advantageous it is to you to be part of a network depends crucially on how many other people are part of that same network. So think of a telephone system, right? How useful that telephone on your desk is to you depends on how many other people have telephones on their desk. If nobody else has a telephone on his desk, that's a useless ornament as far as you're concerned. Or think about email networks or whatever. It's an externality in the sense that when somebody else joins, that person benefits from joining, but he also confers an external benefit on you by his joining because you're better off that he's connected or that more people in general are connected. So thanks to network externalities, the big get bigger. The incentive is for the big to get bigger. Everybody wants to join a bigger network rather than a smaller one. As they join, that advantages, first of all, the people that join, don't forget that, but also it advantages the people who are already members of the big network and who are advantaged already because they're members of the big network. So the rich get richer thanks to network externalities. Third is a slightly amorphous category of language, codes, categories. Ideology would fit in there if you go for that sort of thing. So combines various things. Theorists of linguistic justice go on about how it's an injustice that some people speak the dominant world language as their first language and others only as their second language. Theorists of social mobility say that it's a disadvantage to the working class, that they use what linguists call a restricted linguistic code, a lot of you-knows and, gestures rather than precise formulations. And that prevents or hinders anyway their upward social mobility. And of course, theorists of gender justice and racial injustice say that biases built into the language embody stereotypes that render some groups at a serious disadvantage vis-a-vis others. In terms of the internal sources of these structural advantages, I think a lot of it has to do with information. It's easier if everybody speaks the same language. We all have an interest in being able to communicate with one another. We all have an interest in speaking the same language. Different ones of us have an interest in which language that should be. It's an unequal coordination game. The standard story is the battle of the sexes. I prefer to go to the opera. My partner prefers to go to the wrestling match. But more than anything else, each of us prefer to do something with one another. And so I have a preference and she has a preference for which one it is, but most of all, we want to do the same thing. Languages are like that as well, I think. More generally, it's convenient for purposes of coordinating action with one another that we all employ the same coding categories, even if they are, at least to some extent, maybe not massively biased in favor of some people rather than others. Even the people that they're biased against benefit from the ease of coordination from using the same categories as one another. In terms of external resources, I think the story is network externalities again. As I've just said, everybody wants to coordinate on the same language, coding categories, or whatever as other people. And so the more people that are using that language or set of coding categories, the more other people want to join in using that. So the people who are already using it are advantaged because it's already the biggest, and they're further advantaged as other people pile in wanting to use whatever is the biggest. The rich get richer in language and coding category terms again. Social expectations and norms confer advantage. Expectations and norms are social stabilizers. We expect the future to be much like the past, and in acting on that expectation, it becomes more likely to be true. It is like the past. Descriptive expectations, anyway, can in that way be sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. So, a standard example, the teacher expects the black kid in class not to do very well academically. The teacher doesn't invest very much time in helping that kid learn the lessons. As a result of not being taught, the kid doesn't do very well academically, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? In terms of prescriptive norms, expectations surrounding them, those, by definition, reflect existing social practices and structures, and they perpetuate themselves because it's in the nature of mere norms, unlike laws, that there is no formal structure by which you can move an amendment to them, right? How do you change norms? I mean, it's not like changing a law. You put down an amendment, it's tabled for a vote, you vote on it. Nothing like that in mere social norms. So they're sticky, and that's another way in which they perpetuate advantage. The advantage continue to be advantaged. In terms of internal sources, I think the norms and expectations and their stickiness help in an informational way, enabling people to plan their lives in confident expectation of what's coming down the track. They are able, in using those norms and expectations, to exercise temporally extended agency, as philosophers say. And the external sources, well, as I was saying earlier, a lot of them have to do with self-fulfilling prophecies, the feedback loop, something, if it's expected, is more likely to happen just because it's expected. It's the confidence trick that I was referring to when talking about the global reserve currency of choice. Reputation confers advantage. Having a reputation for power, for example, or for status, or for having a good network, or just for being reliable. All of that works to your advantage. Part of the story is self-fulfilling prophecy and law of anticipated reactions again. Other people won't challenge you if you have a reputation for power or status that you can invoke to bring power to bear on others. But there is also an external source, and that's what sociologists call preferential attachment. It's sort of their analog to network externalities, I think. The thought is that people want to attach themselves to other people to whom a lot of other people are already attached. So when Hobbes says a reputation for power is power, what he goes on to say, to explain that, is that, look, the more underlings I have who depend on me for support, the more underlings I have that I can put into the field in battle. So, the more people I have under me, the stronger I am, the more people want to be under me, right? The rich get richer. The same is true in the way I just described about networks. And finally, organization and schemes of coordination confer advantage. Schneider, an old political scientist, wrote that organization just is the mobilization of bias, right? Or anyway, once you're organized, there's bias built into the organization. The better organized, the better coordinated can beat those who are unorganized and uncoordinated pretty much every day of the week. The internal informational sources of that advantage are just that, well, if you have a standing coordination arrangement or an organizational structure, it just reduces the time and attention you have to devote to crafting new arrangements each time you want to do something, right? If you've got standing arrangements, you just invoke those. Don't have to go through all the negotiations. One source of organizational and coordination advantage. The other, the external source of it, is again network externalities and preferential attachment. The more people who are already within your organization or your scheme of cooperation, the more attractive it is for other people to join in that rather than some other to stay outside it. And for that reason, those who are organizationally enriched get richer still. Well, there is a very quick trot through the main sources of structural injustice and what I think underlie them. So what are you going to do about it? And let me just say in advance, I wish I had a better story here. I'll make a virtue of necessity and argue that it's actually good that I don't have a better story, or anyway, in a social scientific sense, good that I don't have a better story. But I apologize if you were hoping for a rabbit to come out of the hat. No hair is in sight. The standard thing you'll find in this literature as to what you should do about structural injustice is, disrupt it. Well, okay, fine, but then what? We need a positive program. If the weak disrupt, the weak being weak can't keep the disruption up forever, and just disrupting doesn't give them advantages, it just undercuts the advantaged guys. What we really need is something to follow the disruption, a positive program. And that's what I've been going through all these mechanisms, hoping I might be able to come up with. Another standard suggestion, this is Iris Marianne Young's suggestion, her social connection model of responsibility for structural injustice is, organized collective action. Well, fine, yes, good, but by whom and toward what ends? We need, again, a program, and we need, as part of that program, a positive program of action, some specification of who's supposed to do what within it. You can't just say, as Iris does, well, it would be not my place as some distinguished Chicago professor to tell poor people what to do. Well, it's a cop-out. I mean, they need, some idea of what the positive program is supposed to be and how they should organize it and who should do what within it. So the standard suggestions, I think, are just fluff at the end of books. But what has been underlying all of my discussions so far points to another issue, and that's the at what cost issue. Disrupting, destroying the mechanisms of structural advantage I've been discussing comes at a cost, because, as you may have noticed, in explaining the internal and external sources of those structural advantages and disadvantages, I've been pointing out, where do they come from? They come from the fact that those mechanisms serve some socially useful purpose, not just to the guys on top, but often to the guys at the bottom. It's to the advantage of the guy who joins the bigger network, as well as to the advantage of the guys in the bigger network that he's joining, that he joins the bigger network. Everybody wins more than others. Some win more than others. But if we just destroyed networks, common languages, or whatever, everybody's going to be worse off. Some people more than others, but everybody's going to be worse off. So we need to think about the question of disrupting and replacing with something else. Well, at what cost? We're losing something of value. It may still be worth doing, but recognize the fact that it comes at a cost. So, looking at the internal constraints, the first of those underlying drivers, what can we do about them? Well, remember I said the problem was limited time and attention, and so one way of responding to these informational constraints might just be to supply more information. That's not very helpful, because the problem is time and attention, not just availability of information. I mean, you can get tons of information on the internet. You just don't have time to process a small fraction of it. Attention is the limiting factor, the bottleneck here. So just supplying information is not going to be very useful. Maybe thinking of those category sources of disadvantage, you might say, well, maybe trying to suggest some alternative ways of looking at things, alternative framings that don't disadvantage people who are already disadvantaged would be one way of helping with structural injustice. That's good as far as it goes, but it's got to be more than just perceptual change. You've got to have some sort of organizational structure and driver to drive it through. And how are you going to come up with a useful organizational intervention? Well, again, the no-brainer thought that turns out indeed to be a no-brainer is a coalition of the disadvantaged. Well, weak plus weak tends to equal weak, right? I mean, so that just getting all the disadvantaged people together is not going to create a very strong movement unless you do something really very different and special with the movement. That thought leads to another, that maybe finding a new cleavage, a new way of cutting through society, a new way of creating coalitions that put different groups of people together, not just all the weak together and all the strong together, might be a good political program for overcoming some of these disadvantages rooted in organization. And if you can find one, great. And some of the ones, the candidate restructurings, coalitions organized around climate change or something might have this property, and that's good. It's a bit hard to organize, but it might work. And finally, a sort of a new management sort of story as well. Self-organizing is good by way of loosely coupled networking, the strength of weak ties, in Mark Granovetter's phrase. You can hopefully achieve this by just letting people get together in coffee shops or bars or wherever and find common interests for themselves instead of trying to organize something from the top, which is harder. It might work, it might not. As regards those external opportunities that drove mechanisms of structural injustice, one of them, remember, was goods that increase with use. Again, I emphasize you don't want to just destroy these resources that increase with use, or anyway, you don't want to willy-nilly, because they benefit people, certainly the people that hold them. It's coming with a cost to just destroy them. So maybe what you really want to do is to try to find ways of distributing those goods that have this wonderful property in a way that's a bit more equal, and so everybody gets a benefit from that. It might, again, not be all that easy. There's a lot of this would involve asking people to undertake a long-term investment, building up a reputation for trust or something. And it could be that people who are seriously disadvantaged or living hand to mouth don't really have the spare capacity to take the risks involved in those long-term investments. So one way to become trusted is to trust others, but to trust others is to render yourself vulnerable to being exploited by the others who you're trusting. And, you and I maybe can afford that, but, some guy who really doesn't know where the rent's coming from next week may not be able to afford to do that. Finally, increasing returns to scale. What can we do about those? Well, again, we don't want to destroy them incautiously. We want to keep them working, but working for everybody's advantage. So one thought of what to do with them might be to treat them like natural monopolies. You regulate them to operate as best you can in everybody's advantage. you tax away excess advantages and redistribute what you've taxed away from the rich to the poor. One of the worries about that sort of strategy is that there are some advantages that just aren't transferable from one person to another. So, human capital, right, my knowledge I've acquired. I mean, you can tax away any economic gains that I achieve as a result of that. You can't take the knowledge out of my head and transplant it into somebody else's head. Or a reputation, you know. You can tax away the benefits I get from having whatever reputation I have, but you can't transfer my reputation to another. So that, insofar as that's a common characteristic of these goods, that would be another barrier to that solution. Well, as I say, I wish I had better solutions. The upshot is more discouraging than I'd hoped in getting into this project. There are not all that many, all that great ways that I can see. Maybe you could have done if I'd tried this book on you at an earlier stage. But there are not many good ways I can see to overcome these mechanisms that I've been discussing anyway, that drive structural injustice. But as I foreshadowed, let me now try to make a virtue of necessity. I can't see any good way to do it, but as I come to think about it, maybe that's good, or maybe anyway it's a virtue of my social scientific analysis, because the one thing we know for sure about structural injustice is it's hard to overcome. And any analysis that purported to tell you it was easy just wouldn't have been a credible analysis. So, oh well, it was worth a try.
On that note, join me and thank Bob for this
thank
lovely
you.
lecture. What remains is for everybody who asks questions to coordinate and write a review of the book.
Yes, quite.
And also there are some upcoming talks. On October 5th we have Emily Clancher Merchant, Challenging Overpopulation. And October 12th we have Christian Barry, Which Emission Belongs to Us and Not to You, I guess. And October 26th we have Victoria Spicer and Nicole Nisbet, Climate Crisis Norm Entrepreneurs. How successful are they? You're very welcome to come. And if you want to know more about these talks, there are abstracts online. Thank you very much.